If you're worried about what that person is going to say to you or feel about you, I get it. I know that's unpleasant, but you know what you can do? You can blame your accountant. Welcome to the Sunlight Podcast. In this show, we're talking about taxes, money, and careers for self-employed people who have a big vision for changing the world with their work. I'm your host, Hannah Cole, artist, tax pro, and the founder of Sunlight Tax. If you're a creative or soul-centered entrepreneur or wellness practitioner who wants to grow your business sustainably, manage your taxes, and build a stash of fuck you money so you can control your time and have a bigger impact with your work, you are in the right place. Hello, everybody. This podcast episode is going to drop just a couple days before the deadline to issue 1099s. And so I wanted to do a follow-up episode to my original 1099 episode, which answers some of the questions that I have seen. These questions are all taken from the live 1099 workshop that I did for the members of Money Bootcamp. But because they're really good questions, I thought I have picked a few of them to just answer right here on the podcast for all of you. All right. So I know that 1099s can be really confusing. If you want the rundown of the basic rules, I'm going to link in this show to my prior 1099s episode because that's the sort of basic situation. But the very short summary here is if you, in the course of your freelancing, your contracting, your small business, if you paid anybody to do work for your business, not personal, but for your business, over $600 cumulatively for the year, then you owe them a 1099. And you must issue that 1099 before the deadline, which is midnight on January 31st. At the end of the show, I will talk to you about what those penalties are so you have a sense of it. But the IRS actually did just bump up its penalties this year. That's been a trend overall because 1099 reporting, especially for freelancers, is actually one of the key regulation areas to, capture unreported tax income. If you make money and it's in cash, if you make money and it's not reported on a 1099, but it's for your business, it's still reportable income. You still owe taxes on it, of course. And so the IRS wants you to follow the law. So what do they do when they want you to follow the law? They increase the penalties. Okay, so I'll talk about that at the end. But for now, let me jump into a couple little areas where people definitely had some very good questions and were getting confused. So one of them is about goods versus merchandise. Now, there is an exception to 1099 reporting. If you make a payment to somebody for merchandise, you actually do not need to issue them a 1099. I find it a little bit confusing because I think there is a difference between merchandise and goods. Merchandise is clearly for resale, whereas if you buy goods, they might be for you, right? Not for resale. If I buy paintbrushes for my studio, I'm going to use them. I'm not a paintbrush resale place, right? This would be a little different from stretcher bars, which I would then put into the product that I make, which is my paintings. I just had a little moment of revulsion as I call my paintings products. Technically, that's what they are, but we don't really think of them that way in the arts. And that's just one of the little side note. That's just one of the little translation areas that I'm often having to be like, right, in the arts, like when you go to an opening, that's a networking event. Like there's lots of little things like this in the creative world, the creative worlds. Okay, so you do not have to issue a 1099 for merchandise. And this gets to a question I get all the time and did do the definitive research on because a gallery asked me to. Do galleries need to issue their artists a 1099 for artwork sold? And here's the real answer. No. Galleries do not need to issue you a 1099 for work of yours that they sold. I want you to be very, very clear that that is still reportable income and you absolutely do need to report the income and pay tax on it, okay? So just because you didn't get a 1099 for it does not mean you don't report it on your income tax return. And I think a lot of people sometimes get a little loosey-goosey with this stuff. They say unreported. they say cash income, they say under the table, they use these phrases that feel cute. And I just want to translate the IRS wording for that stuff is felony. So don't get cute with it. Just follow the law. That's my recommendation. All right. So a gallery does not need to issue you a 1099. And I believe now that the reason for that is because it's considered merchandise. When you have work at a gallery, it's typically on consignment. The gallery hasn't even paid for it, bought it outright, right? You still own it. They haven't bought it at all from you while it's sitting in their inventory. Okay. So galleries out there, rest your minds. You do not need to issue your artists 1099s. On the other hand, I do want to say if you do issue 1099s, I don't want to come down too hard on you because generally you're trying to do the right thing, and I understand that. And guess what? The IRS understands that too. I never want to fault a gallery that's doing that because clearly that's a gallery that is trying to do the right thing. They just didn't know this little nuance in the law. So that's the answer. But artists, if you're feeling tempted to not report your cash income or your non-1099 income from the gallery, I do want to warn you that I just read through the IRS art gallery audit manual, and one of the sort of issues on that art gallery audit manual is the idea that artists aren't reporting their income from sales because of this, and that it is very frequent if your gallery gets audited and there are any red flags visible, it seems like there may be some lack of rule following, they can then expand that audit and go out and do related party audits. So they will come after you, the artist. All right. So you're never going to go wrong if you're following the law. So what do I recommend? Just follow the law. What about rent? Okay, I got a couple questions about rent. It can feel a little confusing. It feels weird to issue a 1099 to your landlord. You are required to issue a 1099 to the person you pay rent to if it's the owner of the building. Okay. And remember that you only issue 1099s for business uses. So this does not apply to your home studio. Okay. You do not have to issue any 1099 to the person, to your landlord for your apartment, the place that you live, even if you have a home studio. Okay. But if you have a studio or an office outside the home, then yes, you do have to issue a 1099. And be careful, it's not a 1099 NEC for non-employee compensation. It's a different one. It's a 1099 MISC for miscellaneous. There's a box, I think it's box 1, that is for rents. Okay. So if it's the owner of the building that you pay for your studio or office, then yes, you do issue a 1099 MISC. So it's a different 1099. Okay. I have had lots of questions about variations on that theme. Do I owe a 1099 to a nonprofit if I pay a nonprofit? The answer to that is no, you do not. Do I owe a 1099 to my studio mate who I pay the rent to, and she actually has the lease, right? I sublease from her. Well, she's not the owner of the building, and so therefore you do not need to. Okay. Again, you do get to still write it as an expense on your tax return, and whoever ultimately gets the income needs to report it as income. But as long as you follow the law, that's the party you can control, right? You can only control yourself. What about corrections? So sometimes you get a 1099 and it's wrong, right? It's actually probably one of the most frequently wrong documents of all the tax documents you'll get. I have seen people, tax clients, receive 1099s where somebody stuck an extra zero on the end, right? So they made $1,000 of contract income and it got reported as $10,000 of income. That's a big mistake. And you are going to be on the hook paying taxes on that money. So if you didn't actually receive that money, you need to get that person to issue you a corrected 1099. Okay. Now, issuing a corrected 1099 is the law. So I want you to open those envelopes when they come, open those emails when they come. When it says tax documents enclosed, it is the best practice to look at it. And you want to do that sooner rather than later because you want to get back to that person if they did something like that. They got your social security number wrong. They put an extra zero on the income they gave you, or the income amount that they report that they paid you doesn't match what's in your records or is wildly different from what you thought you were paid. You need to have a conversation with that person. And because I've seen this go really sideways, I want to warn you, and I would actually suggest you explicitly say that to the person. Don't assume that they know how to issue a corrected 1099. They must check the corrected box. If you issue a new 1099 and that corrected box is not checked, you are simply issuing a new 1099. So in the case of that artist who I saw her 1099, she had an extra zero reported by somebody. She went back to this person, asked for a corrected 1099. The person didn't remember or didn't know to check the corrected box to report the corrected box essentially will override the original 1099. This person did not check that box. So now she has one 1099 for $10,000 and an additional one for $1,000. So now she has even more reportable income. So it was a double mess. It was an absolute nightmare. This was one of the least pleasant sorting jobs that me and a client have had in memory. So it's not a bad idea if somebody's issued you a 1099 that already had a mistake in it. I wouldn't assume that person isn't capable of making another mistake. And I just will give them a little tip. Hey, make sure you check that corrected box. Okay. Expense reimbursements. What do you do when, for example, as a part of a grant, you have the grant part, but you also are reimbursed for supplies or some other or travel expenses or something else like that? Well, reimbursements are relatively straightforward. There's one of two methods, okay? So if a reimbursement is made under something that is called an accountable plan, in other words, if there is a true accountable plan, it has to have you have to show receipts for the thing you're being reimbursed with, and you have to show them within a certain relatively short time period. Then the law does not require that party to issue you a 1099 reporting that reimbursement as income. Okay. So you can just skip it altogether on your tax return. And that's really nice. But if you are reimbursed for something using a non-accountable plan, in other words, if you never had to show them receipts, they just gave you kind of a blanket amount for supplies or travel or whatever your reimbursement is for, then they are required by law, and they're not doing it because they're jerks. They're required to, by the IRS, report that reimbursement as taxable income to you on your 1099. And they usually will lump it together with if you also received compensation of some kind. They'll generally lump it together with that. Here's the thing. In both scenarios, you come out at zero, though, okay? So the careful thing you want is ultimately someone paid your expenses. You had to foot the bill originally, and then you got paid back, right? So the money came in and went out in both scenarios. So ultimately, your tax should be zero in both scenarios. But here's how it works with the two versions. If it's an accountable plan and they're not reporting it to you as income, you don't list the expense on your tax return, right? You don't list the income and you don't list the expense. Because if you listed the expense, you would now be double dipping and be taking that deduction twice. That's not legal. If it isn't an accountable plan, right? If you're just given a kind of blanket amount for your reimbursement, you're not required to show receipts. They don't have an accountable plan set up. Then yes, they're going to report that reimbursement amount to you as income, taxable income on a 1099, but you get to then report the expense on your expenses on your Schedule C. In other words, effectively, you will still zero out that amount in that case, okay? But you do have to actually keep track of that, all right? This is a thing in general that a good tax preparer will sort out for you. But if you are doing your taxes on your own, and you certainly can, this is a little detail that you want to know about. Okay, I got another question, and this comes up a lot. If you were not expecting a 1099 from someone and you went ahead and have included that, of course, you're reporting the income, and then suddenly that person sends you a 1099, right? An example of this could be that your gallery issues you a 1099 for work that they sold. You've studied the rules. You know that a gallery does not owe you a 1099 for your work sold, but you know also that you need to report that income. So let's say that you've done your taxes and it's on, you've got it all listed out, and now you get a 1099 for income that you're intending to report and you feel like it might, what should you do, right? Okay, so here's what I want to recommend when you freelance, that you tally up all of the income. First of all, it's the law that you have to track all your income. So that should be a part of your practice already. But when you're tallying your income for the year for your tax return, here's what you want to do. I recommend that you keep 2 categories for your income. Put all the income into one or the other, never both, okay? And in one category, you're going to put income that was reported to you on a 1099. And in the other category, income that was not reported to you on a 1099. When you add those 2 categories up, they should equal what your total income was for the year. Okay. So, of course, the point of bookkeeping is that you come up with a tally of all the income you made for the year. That's also your legal obligation to report that number on your taxes. So you should be doing that anyway. That should be part of your practice. But I like to actually list it on the tax return itself as income not reported on a 1099, and I list that amount. Because all the other income that was reported on a 1099, you don't list it directly on your sales number on the Schedule C. You actually enter the information from the 1099 itself and then click the button to transfer that and make it get reported on your Schedule C. Okay. So in the end, one of the checks you should be doing on your tax return is looking at the total income reported on your Schedule C, and it should equal the total income number in your bookkeeping. Okay. Now, here's what happens. If you get a 1099 you were not expecting to get, presumably that amount of income was already in your total income from the year. It just was in the wrong category, right? You had it in the not reported on a 1099 category, and suddenly that 1099 puts it into the 1099 category. So basically, you just want to move it from one column to the other, and you want to subtract that amount from that 1099 out of that total that you're putting on your Schedule C that says income not reported on a 1099. You should subtract the amount of that new unexpected 1099 out of that amount, and then, of course, enter in the info from the 1099. What this will do is keep your total income number the same, and it shouldn't change, right? So you end up still reporting what you earned, which is what you're supposed to report, right? Not more, not less. Okay, now that scenario that I just painted for you, that's what you do before you've actually hit send, before you've actually filed your tax return. That's how you handle it. Now, this is a much more annoying task when you actually have already filed your tax return. So if you've already filed and you get a 1099 you weren't expecting, then I still want you to have broken your categories into the income on a 1099 and then your 1099s. But here's what happens. You get that unexpected 1099. You're going to have to write a little response letter to the IRS. That's if you have been, of course, I am presuming you followed the law and reported that income. So what you need to do is you will write a little letter to the IRS and you'll include an explanation and say, this total was recorded in my income not reported on a 1099 number. It's not additional income. It's not income I forgot to report. It's just income that I did not think I was going to receive a 1099 for, or had not received one to date. Okay. That's the fix. All right. And even better, it's an even stronger letter to the IRS if you have a little screenshot of your bookkeeping that shows your income totals, yes, from a 1099 and no, not from a 1099 category, and you circle the amount in question from that 1099. That's even better. That's really going to put the seal on your case. Okay. So that's how you handle that unpleasant tax scenario. It certainly does happen to people. And if you have a friend who this just happened to, please share this episode because this will definitely be a help to them. Okay. And the last question I want to answer, because this is also a very, very common one, is a question from Jess. Jess says, I've 1099'd angry people before who said they already filed like before the January 31st deadline. Ugh. Then they try to say that they don't have to report it because they maybe didn't know, ... So basically she's saying, it sounds like this is not our fault. Whose job is it to fix, right? So this scenario comes up all the time where people are trying to not report their income and you are trying to follow the law and issue 1099s to them, and they really don't want them. They don't want your 1099 because they don't want to report that income. Well, let me just phrase it. I do a lot of translating back and forth from sort of IRS to creative. Let me just sort of speak to you from the perspective of the tax enforcement agency, right? From that perspective, what you're talking about is a person who wants to break the law, right? You're talking about a person who wants to commit tax evasion, right? So should you help them, or should you go ahead and not aid and abet them in their tax evasion? I mean, that's really how the IRS sees it. That is not a person who is following the law, right? They're breaking the law, and you really are under no obligation and frankly should not help them do it. So if you have to issue a 1099 to somebody, if the law says that you do, you have to do it, and you should do it. And I think you should also feel no guilt about it. You're following the law. It's really not your problem what they do. And the whole point of these rules is it does force that person, in fact, to report their income. And it should. It should. That is what tax fairness is about, that people actually follow the laws. And this is why taxes without representation is the reason our country fought that war with Britain instead of just taxes, right? We didn't just start this country because we were being taxed. We got mad because we were being taxed without representation. If you don't like how the laws are structured, how they're built, you got to talk to your congresspeople. You have to be involved with your legislators. You have to actually call your member of Congress and go for it. Constituent services is there for you. A lot of people are just, living the sitting on the couch eating potato chips, asking their partner for a beer version of democracy, and not actually getting up and giving that democracy flowers and engaging it. So go ahead and engage. If you don't like the laws, by all means, get involved. That's actually something we're supposed to do in a democracy. So, like I said, if somebody's trying to break the law, you're under no obligation to help them do that. What I recommend to you is just follow the rules for yourself and let the chips fall where they may for the other people around you. So long as you're following the law, you'll be fine. You will be fine. And my last little recommendation here, if you're worried about what that person is going to say to you or feel about you, I get it. I know that's unpleasant, but you know what you can do? You can blame your accountant. There's no accountant in the world who doesn't have the same piece of advice. So just go ahead and say, I'm so sorry. I don't want to. I know you don't want this. My accountant just will not sign my tax return and I need it. So I have to do this. And that's the truth. So if you want to say that crazy lady at Sunlight Tax said I have to do this, go for it. You have my full permission. All right. I hope that has been a helpful, clarifying episode. I got into a little bit of weeds on some actual things you might want to do on your tax return if you get into certain mistake or 1099 issues. So I hope that's helpful for you. Definitely let me know. Send me a message if it was helpful or if you have additional 1099 questions. I will also say, because there are just 2 more days until the 1099 issuing deadline, I just wanted to give you a little heads up about the penalties if you don't issue 1099s you need to by midnight, January 31st. So the penalty is per 1099 that you're supposed to file but don't. And if you just miss the deadline by a day or up to 30 days. So in other words, kind of just in the whoops zone, but you fix it within 30 days, your penalty per 1099 is $60. If you're more than 30 days late issuing those 1099s, so it's past, into March, for example, the penalties at that point double to $120 per 1099. And if you wait until August to file your 1099s, the penalty goes to $310. So beware, because if you did your taxes on extension and you're really kind of not even planning to think about this until October, you are going to be in that $310 per missed 1099 zone at the moment that your accountant says to you, I'm not signing this tax return until you file those 1099s. So that is a warning to you that it is very costly and getting costlier to not issue 1099s that you are required to by law. So just go ahead and do it. All right. And for intentional disregard, which I know nobody listening to this podcast is doing, I don't think people listening to this podcast are trying to be tax evasive. But if you intentionally disregard filing each 1099, it's $630 per 1099. So obviously you don't want to be stuck in that boat. You got a couple more days to get those filed. I want you to do it. I know you can. And if you need help with it, I do have a short course on 1099s. If you're just looking for a little last minute help in this course, I have a checklist to get it done. I have tools like a checklist for like, here's the numbers to run in your bookkeeping. Here's the tasks you need to do. Boom, boom, boom. Here's how to eliminate the ones you don't need to send 1099s to. And then here's the tool I use and recommend where you can file them very fast, electronically, and cheaply. So if you want to get that course, if you want the full walkthrough, you can get it at courses.sunlighttax.com/1099. That's the numbers 1099. So courses.sunlighttax.com/1099. That's a $97 course. It's one of the only courses that I ever offer outside of boot camp. It's just a discrete little task that you can just get done one time. So if you've been maybe wanting to see what my teaching is like and how it goes, that's one little nugget that you can get from my trainings. Everything else I put inside boot camp, and it's not gettable outside of that. Okay, so I hope this 1099 training has been helpful to you. Feel free to send the episode to anybody you know, whether it's a gallery who's issuing 1099s, who could totally stop, artists confused about their 1099s, other creative people, anyone you know who has some 1099 confusion. I hope this has cleared up some of those last questions. And if you want that rundown of the basic rules of 1099s, I will link in the show notes to that episode I did 2 weeks ago where I go through the rules for 1099s. All right, go forth, get that paperwork done. You got 2 more days to get it done. Midnight, January 31st is when they're due. And grab that course in the show notes if you need a little extra help. I'll see you next week. Bye. Thank you for listening. If you like the show, be sure to subscribe, leave a review. It really helps, and share it with a friend. I'm so grateful. This podcast is for education and entertainment only. Nothing in this episode should be taken as individual tax or financial advice. You can find all the tools, books, and links we reference at sunlighttax.com/podcast.